to do now is introduce Denise O'Donnell. Denise has a very impressive background, and I encourage you to read it in our materials. I'm just going to summarize a little tiny bit of it. She was the United States Attorney in the Western District of New York. She was the head of the Criminal Justice Agency of New York State, and she was the director of BJA, the Bureau of Justice Assistance in Washington. On top of all of that, she is an unbelievably talented and nice person and my friend, and I could not be more happy to introduce Denise to handle the following panel.
Thanks, Chris. I think one of my accomplishments that I'm most proud of is the fact that Chris became a fellow at BJA when I was there and really started the national focus on best practices that is, I think all of you are benefiting from here today. So I'm a big admirer of hers as well. So I'm so excited that we're starting off the conference after our lead speakers this morning who talked about so many important issues facing prosecutors by focusing on pretrial reform. And personally, it was almost about 8 years ago when I went to the Bureau of Justice Assistance that I began to start working in the pretrial area. And I have to say that the combination of things that our panel before talked about, of looking at the data, as well as looking at the impact of practices that I, for one, as a prosecutor for 17 years, took for granted, never questioned, never thought much about. And the more and more I learned about our bail system, our pretrial system, the more and more questions it raised in my mind about, isn't there a better way? Isn't there a way that is better at ensuring public safety, where we now have a system where people who have committed serious crimes can actually get out of bail or have bail posted for them? That doesn't really protect us. And then to visit a jail and look at the jail overcrowding problem that we have in our country and recognize that there are so many people who are now in jail because of poverty, because they can't afford to post a bond, or because they're mentally ill. And so, you know, it's pretty clear, I think, to me and to most of us, that we can do better. The question is, how? As Beth McCain said before in the other panel, we know the time has come to re-examine our pretrial system. So where do we go from there? And I think there's room for disagreement about the process, but not so much room for disagreement about whether we should move in this direction. And I've been a firm believer since I first became aware of the issues that prosecutors should be leading the way. You are the ones that know where the solutions lie. You're the ones that know how we can do this in a way that's consistent with public safety. So I'm excited to be here. We're going to hear from the experts, a very exciting lead speaker and panelists who are leading prosecution leaders in this area of pretrial reform, who are very familiar with the issues and familiar with the solutions as well. So I'm going to begin, my instructions are no reading of bios, to introduce our lead speaker, Charisse Fano-Burdine, who I knew from BJA days, and who is a person who I think is one of the leading speakers and most knowledgeable people in the country on pretrial reform. And every day, because I sign up for the newsletters of her organization, the organization that she leads, the Pretrial Justice Institute, the very first thing on my email every morning is an email from them. So I get to follow a lot of what they do in the country. I have to confess that at my first presentation that I sat through, that Charisse was involved in with a group that were working on the Justice Reform Initiative, Justice Reinvestment Initiative. We sat around when Charisse was talking about eliminating money bail and said, you can never do that. And now we've seen some really remarkable progress in this area. And we've seen some remarkable investigations of the money bond industry by the New York Times and others that really shed a lot of light on the practice. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce a friend, a colleague who I very much admire and who you're going to learn a lot from this morning. Charisse.
Good morning. Or good afternoon for some of us who flew in from the East Coast. My eating schedule is completely off today. I realize that this morning we are competing with probably one of the most important days in the Supreme Court nomination hearing. So I actually came early this morning to stand in the back of the room and watch most of you engaged in multitasking. So I'm not nervous today because I know you're not half listening to me. It's totally fine. I'll talk. You'll hear my voice until about 11 o'clock, and then we'll switch to the panel. For that reason, and because I'm pretty sure most of you know how to read, there's a presentation that was loaded in the materials section for this conference. I hope that you all have had a chance to see it, and I'm actually going to deviate slightly from a traditional kind of going through that PowerPoint because I know that you can read. So kind of first and foremost, I just want to say thank you for the opportunity to come and talk about these issues. They are incredibly important and in the news on a regular basis. I first want to say, though, in listening this morning to our opening panel and the prosecutors and their backgrounds, and in flipping through the bios of people in this room, and in hearing my own bio often referenced when I speak before crowds, I have a slightly different version or a slightly different perspective on my biography these days, which is that my biography, and maybe yours, is really nothing more than a reflection of my own privilege in this country, growing up white and in a well-to-do family, where being an overachiever was the minimum standard for existence. Anyone else grew up in that house? No? Yeah. It's an interesting way to grow up, and it is contextually important, I think. And why would I raise that to you today? I think it's because these are incredibly challenging times in the space of racial and economic justice issues in this country. And I believe it's important and incumbent upon all of us who work in criminal justice and public safety issues who do not come from the life experiences of the people that we arrest, detain, prosecute, punish, to strive to be as humble as we possibly can about what we know, what we don't know, and what's likely something that we'll never be able to know. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about, and I'm just going to clearly use my finger in the wrong way this morning. I want to kind of bottom line up front for you what is in the content of my presentation, which you can read through later. Number one is that bail reform is first and foremost about public safety. So if, in fact, at the coffee break or at the reception tonight, you want to talk to me about why, in your community or from your perspective, bail reform is part of some liberal agenda in this country, I would be happy to have that conversation with you about how, first and foremost, this is an issue about public safety. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but there is a lot of detail in my presentation and on our website about why the way in which we're doing bail reform in this country today is at great risk to public safety, the way we're doing bail in this country. And the way we do it, this is my second bottom line up front, is that it contradicts completely our commitment as a community to public safety. The third major point is that there is a simple fix to this. There are a lot of entrenched and very difficult reform elements in criminal justice and policing and sentencing and the like. Pretrial justice is actually not one of those incredibly complex, hard to implement, or would take a long time to see the positive results. So that should be good news. And we at the Pretrial Justice Institute started in 1971 by a grant from the Justice Department, and over the course of those 42 years, having enjoyed periodic funding, Denise, would you please come back? Periodic funding from the Justice Department, we can help, and many others can help coach you through this. The fourth bottom line up front is that the public supports this, and that's actually where I'm going to start. I'm going to skip over the first couple of slides in my presentation and really just refer you to them, but one thing I do want to show you is this. These two slides in the presentation, I'll just ask you, you won't be able to read them necessarily from the back. The bottom just tells you what the question was. We do public opinion polling at Pretrial Justice Institute. It's been an important component of understanding how far out ahead of the general public are some of the reform ideas that are in criminal justice, and how do people really feel? Many people do polling about how does the public feel about criminal justice. But there are a couple of important public opinion pieces that relate specifically to prosecutors in our most recent polling. And one question was around, do you believe that it is the role of an arrested person to have to make the case for themselves that they are releasable and honoring our presumption of innocence? Or do you think that it's the prosecutor's job to make the case for detention when it's appropriate? The Supreme Court, of course, has referenced detention as the carefully limited exception, and Chief Justice Rehnquist has imparted upon this country the notion that preventive detention hearings are an important component of due process. Well, guess what? The public actually believes that that would be the best way to accomplish public safety. So you have support. The other public opinion piece, and in some prior polling, prosecutors really do have the faith and trust of the public, despite some of the press coverage every once in a while to the alternative. There is a role on behalf of victims of public safety that you play, and the public supports notions of fairness and public safety that you put forward. And so they do believe that these are among some of the most important criminal justice safety issues that we can be tackling. But I'm going to switch over to slide 7 in the deck, because I really just want to talk a little bit with you in my remaining time about, as Denise said, if we're no longer here to debate the issue about whether or not this is an important topic or should be a topic of conversation, or whether pretrial detention in this country matters. One of my favorite statistics that's not in my presentation, but one of the most interesting statistics we calculated recently from the Bureau of Justice Statistics annual report on jail population data, is that about 95% of the growth in our jail populations in this country since 2000, 95% of the growth in our jail populations since 2000 is simply pretrial detention. So as we have seen jail populations continue to increase despite lowering crime rates, the vast majority of jail population growth in our jurisdictions are people being detained, and simply detained on, particularly on bonds that they cannot meet. So there's a great bit of activity happening in the spaces of legislation and litigation and community engagement, community pressure on systems to reevaluate the way in which they are making decisions about who should be detained and who should be released pending trial. Is your toolkit complete? So on this slide, I really just wanted to have you be able to think about what's happening in your own jurisdiction and ask yourselves whether or not your toolkit is complete. I live with someone, my hopefully almost husband, if you guys want to put a little pressure on him. He's like addicted to Home Depot, right? So every weekend it's about where are we going to go to Home Depot, because he has to have a complete set of materials before he starts what clearly don't seem to me to be important projects each weekend, but are very vital to his survival apparently. So an important thing about a toolkit is that you have everything you need, and when he starts on a project, if in fact he doesn't have the right screws, or if the battery for the drill is down, these are things that make it really impossible for him to complete the full breadth of the assignment that he has undertaken for himself. And bail reform is very similar. If in fact you cherry pick or a la carte bail reform, you will not have a complete toolkit that will enable you to recognize and realize not just the cost savings and the public safety benefits of pretrial reform, but the very outcomes that your community is expecting of you. And so these are the things, and I'm available, I'll be here all day. And if it's a cash bar tonight, please come see me if you want to talk about pretrial. I'm happy to exchange any expertise for a glass of Pinot Grigio. Because people are going to ask me questions, as they always do, about pretrial assessment tools. Do they work? Do they not work? What about the racial bias? Where do you use them? How do you use them? I'm happy to talk about those. But just let me be clear. I have never met a jurisdiction in which we have said, you know what you should do? You should just let 90% of people who get arrested released on personal recognizance and just give them a court reminder. There isn't a single jurisdiction I've ever met that's been able to shift away from their current culture of setting money bond to a culture of just release. So how do you move in that direction? You have to actually provide assessments to the court that tell people how likely they are, to tell the courts how likely people are to come to court and stay arrest-free pending trial. So it's an important component of this, but it's often misunderstood, it's misdiscussed, it's misrepresented in the media, and in fact, it's often misused. Assessment tools cannot and should not result in detention in and of themselves. They should tell you things about a person that you can then help mitigate those concerns around. Court date reminders, you know, this is sort of a no-brainer. If there's a jurisdiction in the country that still has a question about whether reminding people of their court dates is an important component of ensuring appearance in court, I would question why we have doctor's offices and salons and dentist office that call us to remind us of our own appointments. And community-based support. So, you know, there's a revolution trying to happen inside probation and parole that has shifted it from a sort of an entirely law enforcement focused, let's catch people doing violations of probation, to an atmosphere of let's help people be successful, because it's actually better for public safety if people comply with restrictions and conditions and get reattached to family housing and employment. Those similar things are involved in the front stage during a pretrial phase, although with different legal implications. And then you not only have to have tools that support success, you have to have tools that support an ability, and this is really where prosecutors, in my perspective, have the most to gain in terms of bail reform with respect to public safety. If in fact what we're hoping to find are those, statistically, it's shown that we're talking about 5 or 10 people out of every 100 who are the folks that you're the most concerned about, who are the most dangerous, who pose the most risk to victims and public safety. And those are the folks that you're hoping to be able to detain pending trial. And having the tools you need to do that, rather than the Russian roulette wheel of let's pick a dollar amount and hope that that person is unable to meet that dollar amount. This is actually some of the basis for litigation happening in the country, because that's a sort of an unconstitutional way of affecting detention. So having limited preventive detention, having a narrow net for detention that complies with what the Supreme Court has asked us to do, and having a due process component to this, that's an important and vital part of this. And first and foremost, many of the jurisdictions that we've worked with who have successfully implemented the full array of pretrial justice reforms have started this process at the very, very, very front door, which is there an opportunity to expand the use of citations in lieu of arrest so that you aren't even bothering to bring people into the incarcerative jail setting, where the booking process and the assignment of a money bond is often what ends up having them detained pending trial. So when I say, you know, what we're trying to do in this country is move us from where we were to a more a smarter pretrial system, this is what we mean. So what does a smart pretrial system look like? So Denver County was involved in a smart pretrial project that we ran under Denise's leadership at the Bureau of Justice Assistance, Yakima County, Washington, if there's anyone here from Washington State. Dan, and the entire state of Delaware were 3 jurisdictions that worked on that smart pretrial project. But we have a number of jurisdictions that, you know, we sort of talk about in terms of having implemented a smarter way of doing this work in order to protect victims and public safety. So the first is that you effectuate an immediate release of eligible people, and whether that's at the pretrial, pre-booking, or pre-arrest stage is entirely up to the jurisdiction. But if in fact in your jurisdiction a person is ineligible for a jail sentence, maybe the charge for which they have been arrested is probation presumptive, is it really necessary then to book them into the jail? Can you give them a citation, remind them of their court date, and have them processed in that way? So the immediate release of eligible people on citations. Having an actuarial assessment tool, which is something I already raised as a topic in this conversation. There are two important things that we're really trying to predict. If you're in a jurisdiction that has a really, is using one of the more advanced tools, you may actually even get to predict a third thing, which is not just risk of non-appearance in court or risk of rearrest pending trial, but is that person have a propensity for violence, which is an important component. The early review of charges by seasoned prosecutors, Beth referenced that in part of the reforms that Denver has undertaken. It's certainly, it's been astounding to many in the public to understand that it sometimes, at these hearings, not only are people not represented by defense counsel, but they're also not represented, the state is not represented in those hearings. So having both actors involved in that first appearance hearing, where liberty is at stake for the person who's been accused of a crime, is an important component of this system. It produces better outcomes. Detention occurs through this adversarial process, as I mentioned, and court reminders. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this next slide really talking about different assessment tools. How many people live in a jurisdiction, work in a jurisdiction where you have, that you know of, a locally validated pretrial assessment tool in use? That's great. How many people do not or don't know?
You need a third question.
Which is what?
We have one, but it's not been validated.
Well, sure. Okay. Great. Yes. My least favorite answer, which is you have one and it hasn't been validated locally. That's great. It used to be when Denise and I would go in rooms, maybe a third of the folks would be in jurisdictions that had functioning systems that involved assessment tools. These are just three of the kind of, people always say, well, Charisse, what tools should we use? I say we don't really give out good housekeeping seals of approval, except for a set of core principles around assessment tools. You should, as a prosecutor, you should know exactly how that tool was designed and developed. You should know how the items that appear on that tool got there, what their weights are, and you should know the outcomes, meaning you should know the profile of your arrested population and whether or not it is tracking along with what the tool predicts. So if your tool has a scale of 1 to 5, and people who score a 1 on your tool are, by research, 93% likely to come to court arrest-free, is your own population reflective of that? So there should be some tracking mechanism that shows that. The second reason I have this slide up here is about items on a tool. So I get asked these questions by reporters constantly. What's the value of an assessment tool? And here's what I say. Assessment tools do one thing and do one thing incredibly well, and that is they narrow down the number of things that courts should be taking into consideration when determining the conditions of release for an individual. There are hundreds of variables about me as a person, in my background, in my demographics, in my history, in my the great number of shoplifting events that I got away with as a kid. There are lots of things about me. And if a court were to take into consideration all of those things, it would be very hard to track the outcomes associated with those decisions. So I've seen courts where, and you've probably practiced in front of judges, in which you know that judge, you know what their pet peeves are, you know what their, what kind of mood they're in that day is going to actually determine what are the outcomes for folks who come before those judges on that particular day. And so what assessment tools do is really pare down the number of things that courts should be looking at, not in totality about the person arrested, but when looking at the conditions of release prior to trial. These are the only things that science has shown are predictive. Criminal histories are in here, and there's a lot of discussion about criminal histories and whether or not it introduces racial bias. I would argue that the entire system is permeated with racial bias, and it would be erroneous to put the weight of eliminating racial bias in the system on an assessment tool whose job it is to look at appearance in court and public safety during this short pretrial phase. But what we do know is that when jurisdictions use tools that are validated, they can reduce racial disparity, sometimes eliminate racial disparity at this particular decision point. In your binder, you will see some of what I'm talking about. So the two jurisdictions that I've pulled out here that I won't go into a lot of detail about, but this is a slide that will show you two pieces of data from Yakima County, Washington, which was a smart pretrial site. One is with respect to differences in racial disparity prior to pretrial justice reform and post pretrial justice reform. And when we first said to Yakima County, Washington, we're going to look at racial disparity in your bail system, they said, Sharice, that's going to be easy. We don't have any people of color in Yakima County, Washington. And I said, I bet if you have 3 people of color in Yakima County, Washington, 2.5 of them live in your jail. So I'm pretty sure that you have disparity. It just depends on how you describe it. So they were able to reduce disparity in Yakima County. And in particular, what's important is that this notion of rising tides raise all boats. But in particular in Yakima County, the boats of people of color were raised even more substantially. And on the right, it talks a little bit about the goals of smart pretrial. The goals being maximize release, maximize appearance, and maximize public safety. And are we doing that? And you see in Yakima County there were great results. My other favorite new place, never thought I'd say that, is New Jersey. That was supposed to be a joke, apparently. Are you all from New Jersey and therefore highly offended at my remark? Love New Jersey. So one of the things that you'll see from this slide with respect to New Jersey is that it too is a great example of implementing a host of pretrial justice reforms, a suite of reforms, not focusing on one thing or the other. And so they implemented things in New Jersey as a result of legislation that focused on speedy trial and discovery and focused on detention and effectuating, actually legally effectuating detention when it was called for. And so in New Jersey now, in the state courts, much like the federal system, and much like the juvenile justice system in New Jersey, if in fact prosecutors wish to have a detention of an individual who's been arrested for public safety concerns, they can just request a public safety hearing, a detention hearing. And so I want to point out that the other thing they did here was expand citations in lieu of arrest. And so they had more than 44,000 cases in 2017. They had 143 arrests in the state of New Jersey. 98,000 of those 144,000, so 2/3 of those, were people who were given a citation in lieu of arrest. That reduced dramatically the volume of people coming to the jail in the first place. That reduced caseloads for folks initially dealing with people who've been incarcerated at the pretrial stage. So of the 143,000, 98,000 were issued citations, and of the 44,000 cases that were booked into a jail, only 44 of them were required to post some kind of money bond prior to trial. So the rest of them were released on their own recognizance or under some level of supervision in the state. And what we know is that the crime rate's continuing to go down in New Jersey, despite the hem and haw of bail bondsmen who are just assuredly working as hard as possible in the press to assert that small children and the elderly in New Jersey are being victimized left and right as the result of their business going out of business. The pretrial detention population is already down 26%, and we think that number will continue to rise. So this is my last slide. What does it cost? I would argue that the cost to getting this wrong and continuing to do business the same way we've always done it is actually higher than the cost, both monetary and psychologically, mentally, whatever you want to call it, of making these kinds of changes. You all know that it costs money to keep people in jail, and it's actually much cheaper to manage and supervise people in the community. We're talking real dollars here in terms of cost avoidance or cost savings. So I'm going to let my colleagues who come from jurisdictions actually talk a little bit about their own experiences. And as always, we are available to help in any way we can. Some of these great studies focus on things that in particular matter to different political stripes. I'm not sure there's as little daylight between positions in this room, but I do believe that regardless of your motivation for coming to pretrial justice as a topic, whether you want to avoid litigation, and I'm happy to help you talk about how to do that, whether you're coming at this from a cost savings perspective, from a concern about poor communities or communities of color, it sort of doesn't matter. There are communication strategies that can support regardless of your motivation, and there are outcomes that can support the things that you're interested in. So I look forward to sharing those with you and being a resource to anyone in this room. Thanks for your time.
Thanks so much, Sharice. And I want to get back to you on the online resources that you have, which are tremendous also at PJI. And the work that you do following what's going on in each state in pretrial reform, which I think will be invaluable to this particular group.